There is a taste some of you carry without knowing where it comes from. Not a recipe, just the memory of corn on a dry comal in a kitchen that had almost nothing else. During the 1930s, Mexican families across the American Southwest survived the Depression the way their mothers had taught them south of the border. They did not line up at soup kitchens. They cooked. They stretched every grain of corn, every wild green growing in a ditch, every scrap of organ meat into meals that kept children standing through another week. Number 22 on this list made some people look away, but the families who ate it never went hungry. And number 3 on this list was already ancient, when the Aztecs were still building their empire. So hit subscribe, because here are 25 forgotten foods Mexican migrants ate to survive the 1930s. Number 25. Verdolagas con frijoles. Purslane grew wild in ditches and along irrigation canals across South Texas and the San Joaquin Valley. Mexican migrant families picked it for free. Cooked down with pinto beans, a little onion, and whatever chilies were on hand, verdolagas made a full meal out of nothing. The leaves have a slight tartness, almost like a lemon squeezed into the pot without the lemon. Most Anglo families sprayed it with herbicide or pulled it out of their gardens. Mexican mothers collected it in aprons and boiled it into something their children actually liked eating. Verdolagas are high in omega-3 fatty acids, something nutritional science would not identify for decades. The families who ate them did not need a study to know the plant kept them strong. Number 24. Chacals. In the mountains of Chihuahua, families dried whole ears of corn on rooftops until the kernels cracked and shriveled into hard golden nuggets. They carried this dried corn across the border because it weighed almost nothing and lasted for months without spoiling. To cook chacals, you soaked the kernels overnight, then simmered them in a clay pot with dried chilies and a ham bone if you had one. The result was a thick, smoky soup that tasted like the corn had been roasted twice. Migrant families working the railroads in New Mexico and Arizona kept bags of chacals in their belongings, the way other workers carried canned goods. By the time the next generation settled into city apartments, there were no rooftops for drying corn, and the whole tradition faded within a single generation. Number 23. Panocha de trigo. This is not the brown sugar cone most people think of when they hear the word panocha. Panocha de trigo was a pudding made from sprouted wheat, slow cooked for hours until the natural sugars in the grain caramelized into something dark and sweet, without adding any sugar at all. Women in northern New Mexico and southern Colorado made it every spring, especially during Lent when money was already tight. The wheat was soaked in water for days until it sprouted, then ground on a metate and cooked in a heavy pot over low heat. The whole process took close to a week from start to finish. Children scraped the pot clean. The pudding had a malty, almost molasses-like flavor that came entirely from the grain itself. When store-bought desserts became cheap and widely available in the 1950s, almost nobody wanted to spend a week making something they could buy for a dime. Number 22. Chansaquillas. In the small towns of Chihuahua and Durango, women made candy from 2 ingredients, piloncillo and pecans. The piloncillo was melted slowly in a heavy pot until it turned into a dark, bubbling syrup. Then handfuls of roughly chopped pecans were stirred in. The mixture was poured onto a greased stone or a piece of tin and scored into small squares before it hardened. Children broke the squares apart and carried them in their pockets. The candy was dense, almost like toffee, with a deep molasses flavor that tasted nothing like the refined sugar sweets sold in American stores. Migrant families made chansaquillas because pecan trees grew wild along the rivers of South Texas and northern Mexico, and piloncillo was cheaper than white sugar. No oven, no special equipment, no dairy. When cheap American candy bars became available for a nickel, the slow work of melting piloncillo lost its appeal. Number 21. Camotes tatemados, a sweet potato buried in the embers of a dying cooking fire and left overnight. That was the method. In the baipos morning, the skin was charred and papery, and the flesh inside had turned soft, dark orange, and so sweet it tasted like it had been soaked in honey. Migrant families across the Southwest in the 1930s roasted camotes this way because it required no fuel beyond what they had already burned for the evening meal. Children peeled the blackened skin with their fingers and ate the flesh plain, sometimes with a squeeze of lime and a dusting of ground chili. In the labor camps of the Rio Grande Valley, camotes tatemados were breakfast for people who had nothing else to cook with before dawn. The technique vanished when gas stoves replaced open fires, and sweet potatoes became something you baked in an oven with butter and marshmallows. The original version, pulled from ashes and eaten with your hands, had a smoky depth that no oven could replicate. Number 20. Pipián verde. Long before mole became a restaurant dish, cooks in Puebla and Oaxaca made pipián, a sauce built on ground pumpkin seeds instead of chocolate or dried chiles. The green version used raw pepitas, tomatillos, and fresh herbs blended into a thick, nutty sauce that coated chicken or pork. Migrant families in the 1930s favored pipián because pumpkin seeds were cheap, grew easily in small garden plots, and stored well through the winter months. The seeds were toasted on a comal until they popped, then ground by hand into a paste. The sauce had a richness that felt like it should have cost real money, but was made from almost nothing. Unlike mole, which required dozens of ingredients and days of preparation, pipián could be finished in under 2 hours. As store-bought sauces filled the shelves, grinding pepitas from scratch became something only the oldest cooks still bothered with. Number 19. Corundas. These small, triangular tamales came north with families from Michoacán who crossed into Texas and California during the 1930s looking for field work. Corundas were nothing like the rectangular tamales wrapped in corn husks that most people picture. They were folded into a sharp triangular shape using the broad green leaves of the corn plant itself, and the masa inside was mixed with milk curds or fresh cheese and a little baking soda that made it spongy and light. The filling was simple, or sometimes nothing at all, just the flavored masa on its own, served swimming in a thin tomato and chile de árbol salsa. A woman could fold dozens of corundas in an hour because the triangular wrap was faster than the traditional husk method. In the migrant camps, the green corn leaves were free for the picking after the harvest, and the cheese came from goat milk the family produced themselves. The little triangles were easy to carry wrapped in a cloth, and field workers ate them cold at midday without needing a plate or a fork. Outside of Michoacán and its diaspora, almost nobody knew what a corunda was. When the Michoacano families settled into mixed Mexican-American neighborhoods, they started making regular tamales instead, because that is what everyone else recognized. The triangular shape and the corn leaf wrapper disappeared from American tables within a generation. Number 18. Cabuches. In the deserts of Zacatecas and San Luis Potosi, families gathered the unopened flower buds of the biznaga cactus every spring before the sun could split them open. The buds had to be picked at dawn, when they were still tightly closed and tender enough to chew without breaking a tooth. Scrambled with eggs, diced onion, and a little serrano chile, cabuches had a faint artichoke flavor and a silky texture that held together inside a folded tortilla. Migrants from the northern desert states could read a hillside the way a fisherman reads water. They knew which buds were safe and which would leave you doubled over. In the 1930s, that knowledge meant free protein in a landscape that looked dead to outsiders. The biznaga grows so slowly that a single plant can take decades to reach maturity. Years of overharvesting turned it into a protected species in Mexico, and selling wild cabuches became restricted. Most people under 60 have never seen one on a plate, let alone tasted one. Number 17. Cueritos en vinagre. Cueritos are strips of pigskin pickled in vinegar with sliced carrots, onions, jalapenos, and dried oregano. In the 1930s, pork skin was one of the cheapest parts at any butcher, often given away because most buyers wanted the meat, not the hide. Mexican families simmered the skin until it turned soft and gelatinous, then packed it into jars with a hot vinegar brine. The jars sat on a shelf for weeks, and the cueritos came out tangy, spicy, and almost rubbery in a way that was oddly satisfying to chew. They were eaten straight from the jar, rolled into a tortilla, or piled onto tostadas with a squeeze of lime. In towns along the Texas border, small shops kept glass jars of cueritos on the counter right next to the register. Making them at home is something most families gave up generations ago. Number 16. Memelas de asiento. A memela is a thick oval of corn masa, thicker than a tortilla but smaller than a huarache, pinched up at the edges to hold a filling. In the 1930s, that filling was almost always asiento, the dark, heavy sediment left at the bottom of the pot after rendering lard. Asiento had an intense, smoky pork flavor and cost nothing because it was considered waste. Spread across the surface of a hot memela and topped with salsa and crumbled cheese, it made a full meal from scraps. In Oaxaca and Puebla, memelas were an everyday breakfast, and migrant women continued shaping them wherever they could get fresh masa in the United States. The word memela itself is old enough that its origins are debated. In most American cities today, you can find a gordita or a sope on a menu, but memelas with real asiento have all but disappeared outside of southern Mexico. Number 15. Tetelas de frijol, a triangular pocket of corn masa stuffed with black bean paste and toasted on a dry comal. The shape alone set tetelas apart from every other antojito. The cook pressed a ball of masa into a round disc, spread a thin layer of refried black beans across the center, then folded 3 edges up to form a triangle and sealed them by pressing the seams with wet fingers. Each tetela was placed on the hot comal and turned slowly until the outside was spotted brown and slightly crisp. Inside, the bean filling melted into the masa so you could not tell where one ended and the other began. Oaxacan and Pueblan migrant families made tetelas in the 1930s because the ingredients were the cheapest things they owned, corn and beans, and the triangular shape made them easy to stack and carry to the fields without falling apart. The dish disappeared from most Mexican-American kitchens because the folding technique was fiddly, and younger cooks defaulted to the simpler round gordita or quesadilla instead. Number 14. Revoltijo de romeritos. Romeritos are a wild herb that looks like rosemary but tastes nothing like it. The small, dark green sprigs grow in marshy ground and have an earthy, slightly mineral flavor that is completely unique. In central Mexico, revoltillo was the dish families made during Lent and on Christmas Eve, mixing romeritos with dried shrimp patties, a simpler version of mole sauce, and sliced nopales into a thick stew that fed everyone without any meat. For migrant families in the 1930s who observed Catholic fasting rules strictly, this dish solved a real problem: how to make a Lenten meal that felt substantial without breaking the fast. The dried shrimp came pressed into hard bricks that traveled well and lasted for months without refrigeration. Women soaked and shredded the shrimp, mixed it with egg and a little flour, and fried small patties that went into the stew alongside the romeritos. The mole was built on dried guajillo and ancho chiles rather than the dozens of ingredients in a true mole negro. What made revoltijo remarkable was the way the flavors layered. The mineral bite of the romeritos, the brine of the dried shrimp, and the deep warmth of the chili sauce created something that tasted ancient and complex, without a single expensive ingredient. Women from Mexico City, Puebla, and Tlaxcala considered it essential for the holidays. Those from northern states had often never heard of it. By the 1960s, Finding fresh romeritos north of the border was nearly impossible. The herb does not grow easily in most American climates, and nobody was importing it. Families substituted spinach or dropped the dish entirely, and within 2 generations, most Mexican Americans had never seen a plate of revoltillo. In a few neighborhoods in Los Angeles and Chicago, specialty markets now carry romeritos during December. But the women who knew how to prepare them properly are fewer every year. Number 13. Minguich. In the Sonoran desert towns and the mining camps of Arizona, fresh corn season meant one thing: minguich. The dish was made by cutting kernels off the cob, cooking them in a pot with strips of roasted green chile, a little onion, and enough water to make a thick stew, then stirring in crumbled queso fresco until it melted into strings through the corn. It was simple, sweet from the fresh kernels, spicy from the chili, and rich from the cheese. The whole thing came together in less than 20 minutes. Migrant families from Sonora who settled in Tucson, Phoenix, and the copper mining towns of southern Arizona made minguich every summer when corn was so cheap it was practically free. The dish had no written recipe because every Sonoran mother already knew it by heart. When canned corn replaced fresh and processed cheese replaced queso fresco, the flavor changed enough that families stopped recognizing it as the same dish. Number 12. Clemole. A thick dark stew from Puebla made with dried chiles, fresh vegetables, and a handful of masa dissolved in broth to give it body. The base was a paste of ancho and pasilla chilies, toasted and ground, then fried in a little lard until the kitchen filled with a deep, earthy smell that was nothing like the bright heat of a salsa. Into that paste went chunks of chayote, green beans, zucchini, ears of corn broken into rounds, and sometimes a few sprigs of cilantro. The masa went in last, stirred into the simmering broth until the liquid thickened into something closer to a porridge than a soup. Families from Puebla and Tlaxcala who migrated north in the 1930s made clemole when there was no meat in the house because the chili paste and the masa together gave the stew enough substance to fill a grown man. On days when someone brought home a rabbit or a few chicken necks, those went in too, but the stew did not need them. Clemole never crossed over into Tex-Mex or California Mexican cooking because it belonged so specifically to the Puebla highlands that even other Mexican families did not recognize it. Number 11. Pan de polvo. These crumbly shortbread cookies, dusted with cinnamon and scented with anise, were at every Mexican celebration in South Texas during the 1930s. The name means dust bread, and the texture explains why. They fell apart the moment you bit into them, leaving a sweet powder on your lips and fingers. The dough called for flour, lard, sugar, cinnamon, and a splash of orange juice or anise tea. No eggs, no butter, no vanilla. The cost was so low that even the poorest households brought a tray to weddings, baptisms, and funerals. In the Rio Grande Valley, pan de polvo was as common at a gathering as cake is at a birthday party today. Mexican bakeries in Texas still sell a version, but the homemade kind, rolled by hand in batches that filled the whole kitchen with the smell of toasted cinnamon, is something most families stopped making a long time ago. Number 10. Ayocotes en caldo. Ayocotes are enormous runner beans, purple and black with swirling patterns on the skin, twice the size of a pinto. They grew on climbing vines in the highlands of central Mexico and produced pods so large that a single plant could fill a clay jar. Migrant families brought dried ayocotes north in cloth sacks and planted them wherever they could find a fence or a post for the vines to climb. The beans were soaked overnight and then simmered for hours in an olla de barro with onion, garlic, a few dried chilies, and a sprig of epazote until the broth turned thick and the beans were creamy inside their tough skins. The flavor was deeper and earthier than any pinto or black bean, with a texture that held its shape even after long cooking. In the 1930s, a pot of ayocotes fed a family for 3 days. They disappeared from Mexican-American kitchens because American seed catalogs did not carry them, and the original dried stock eventually ran out. Without fresh seed from Mexico, the vines stopped climbing. Number 9. Agua de masa. This was not a recipe so much as a survival habit. Women dissolved a small handful of fresh corn masa into a glass of water, added a pinch of salt or a squeeze of lime, and drank it down. In the 1930s, migrant workers in the cotton fields of Texas and the beet fields of Colorado carried agua de masa because it was cheap, filling, and replaced the minerals sweated out in the heat. It tasted like thin, unsweetened atole, earthy and starchy, and it sat in the stomach long enough to keep hunger away for a few hours during a 12-hour workday. There was nothing elegant about it, just corn and water. But it kept people on their feet when there was nothing else available between dawn and sundown. The tradition faded when packaged drinks and thermoses became affordable in the decades that followed, and most people alive today have never heard of agua de masa, let alone tasted it. Number 8. Chilacayote dulce. The chilacayote is a gourd that looks like a watermelon from the outside but has white, fibrous flesh on the inside that separates into long, translucent strands when cooked. In the highlands of central Mexico, families grew it as a fence plant because it climbed anything and produced enormous fruit with almost no care. The dulce was made by simmering the flesh with piloncillo and cinnamon until the strands turned golden and the syrup thickened into something that poured like warm honey. Migrant families valued the chilacayote because a single gourd could weigh over 20 pounds and produce enough preserves to last through the winter. The seeds were saved and planted wherever the family settled, and the vine grew so aggressively that it could cover a fence in a single growing season. In the dry Southwest, it survived on almost no irrigation. The preserved strands were eaten on their own as a sweet, spooned-over bread, or stirred into warm milk for children. Each strand was distinct, slightly chewy, and held the piloncillo syrup inside the fiber so that the sweetness released slowly as you chewed. Women in Puebla and Tlaxcala called it cabello de ángel, angel hair, because of the way the strands separated and caught the light when you lifted them from the pot. When the generation that knew how to grow and preserve chilacayote aged out of the kitchen, the gourd stopped appearing in American gardens. Younger families did not recognize it at the market and had no idea what to do with something that large and strange looking. Number 7. Asadura. This was a stew made from the internal organs of a freshly butchered goat or pig. Heart, liver, lungs, and kidneys were cleaned, cut into small pieces, and braised slowly with tomatoes, onion, garlic, and dried chilies until everything was tender enough to fall apart on a tortilla. In the 1930s, organ meats cost a fraction of what regular cuts sold for, and butchers often gave them away to families willing to take them. The stew was dark, rich, and heavy with iron, carrying a depth of flavor that no ordinary piece of meat could match. Migrant families cooked asadura on butchering days, when the organs were fresh and had to be used before they spoiled. As supermarkets replaced neighborhood butchers and organ meats vanished from the display cases, asadura went from a weekly fixture to something only the oldest members of the family still remembered. Number 6. Pimoles. A small round cookie from Oaxaca made with corn flour, piloncillo, cinnamon, and anise seed, baked on a comal or in a clay oven until the outside turned dry and crumbly, and the inside stayed slightly soft. Pimoles had a gritty cornmeal texture that set them apart from any wheat flour cookie, and the anise gave them a licorice note that lingered in your mouth long after the last bite. In the 1930s, Oaxacan migrant women made pimoles in large batches because they kept for weeks without going stale, wrapped in cloth and stored in a tin. Field workers carried a few in a pocket, and ate them with black coffee during the afternoon break. The cookies required no butter, no eggs, and no wheat, just corn, raw sugar, and spice. When wheat flour became cheaper and more available than masa in American stores, the corn-based pemole lost ground to ordinary pan dulce and disappeared from bakery trays north of the border. Number 5. Garbanzo guisado. Dried chickpeas were among the cheapest legumes available during the Depression, and Mexican families stewed them with tomatoes, onion, and scraps of pork or chorizo into a thick, warming guiso that stretched a single pound of dried beans into enough food for a household. The garbanzos had to be soaked overnight and simmered for hours, but each spoonful felt substantial because the chickpeas held their shape and had a nutty, almost creamy bite. During Lent, the dish was made without any meat at all, just the beans in a thin chili broth with a piece of dried epazote floating on top. It was peasant food in the most honest sense of the word. Cheap, filling, and made from pantry staples that stored indefinitely on a shelf. As canned beans and faster cooking legumes took over American kitchens, the long overnight soak and slow morning simmer of dried garbanzos quietly fell out of practice. Number 4. Caldo de oso. The name translates to bear soup, but there was never any bear in it. In the Sonoran ranchos and the migrant camps of Arizona, caldo de oso was a heavy, restorative broth made from beef bones, cabbage, corn on the cob, potatoes, carrots, and whole cloves of garlic, simmered until the marrow dissolved into the liquid, and the vegetables were soft enough to mash with a spoon. It was called bear soup because the portion was big enough to fill a bear, and because the men who ate it after a long night of drinking swore it brought them back from the dead. Women started the pot before dawn on Sunday mornings, knowing the men would need it. The broth was golden, rich with gelatin from the bones, and the garlic was so concentrated it burned your lips. Migrant families from Sonora made it in every town where they settled, from Tucson to the cotton camps of the Gila Valley. Caldo de oso never appeared on restaurant menus or in cookbooks because it was considered too rough and too simple to write down. Number 3. Chorote. This thick, warm drink was made from toasted corn and raw cacao, ground together and dissolved in water. It is older than chocolate as we know it, dating back to a time before anyone thought to add sugar to a cacao beverage. Women in Tabasco and Chiapas made chorote by toasting dried corn kernels and cacao beans side by side on a comal, grinding them together on a metate until the oils from the cacao darkened the corn paste, and dissolving the mixture in hot water. The drink was grainy, slightly bitter, and deeply filling, closer to a thin porridge than anything you would call a beverage today. In the 1930s, migrant families from southern Mexico carried small pouches of ground cacao and corn in their belongings, and made chorote wherever they could find a fire and a pot. It was breakfast. Sometimes it was also dinner. When instant coffee and powdered chocolate became cheap and available at every general store, chorote was one of the first old traditions to disappear. Today it survives only in a handful of rural communities in the south of Mexico, made by women who learned it from their grandmothers. Number 2. Enchiladas mineras. These came from the mining towns of Guanajuato, where silver miners needed a meal that was cheap, fast, and filling enough to get through a shift underground. The tortillas were dipped in a warm chile guajillo sauce, lightly fried until they just started to stiffen, then filled with crumbled queso fresco and a scatter of raw white onion. No rolling. The tortillas were folded in half and stacked on the plate, then topped with shredded lettuce, sliced carrots and potatoes that had been cooked in the same chili sauce, and a few cubes of fried cheese on top. The whole plate looked more like a salad than anything most people would call enchiladas. Migrant families from the Bajío region brought enchiladas mineras to Texas and California in the 1930s because every ingredient was cheap and the guajillo chiles traveled well in a cloth sack without spoiling. The dish disappeared from American Mexican tables when the word enchilada became locked to the rolled, oven-baked, cheese-covered version that restaurants sold. Nobody folded a tortilla in half and put lettuce on top because it did not look like what the menu said enchiladas were supposed to be. Number 1. Salsa tatemada. The word tatemar means to char something directly over a flame, and salsa tatemada was the most basic, most essential condiment in a 1930s migrant kitchen. Whole tomatoes, chiles, and an unpeeled clove of garlic were placed directly on the iron comal and left to blacken until the skin blistered and split open. Then everything was crushed together with a fork on a plate or mashed between two stones. The charring transformed ordinary ingredients into something smoky, sweet, and layered with flavor. No oil, no pot, no written recipe. Just fire and patience. Every family made it a little differently depending on which chilies they had dried and how long they let the tomatoes burn. It was the first thing placed on the table at every meal, and the last thing scraped from the plate when the food was gone. Salsa tatemada is one of the oldest cooking techniques on the continent, and it slipped away so quietly that most of its recipes were never written down at all. These were the foods that held families together when everything else was falling apart. Not restaurant dishes, not recipes copied from a book, just corn and chilies and whatever the land or the animal gave up that day, turned into something that kept people alive and fed and proud of where they came from. If your family ate any of these, or if your abuela told you about a food from that era that we missed, leave it in the comments. Hit like if this brought back a memory. Share it with someone who grew up eating this way, and subscribe so you never miss another one.